Chapter 3 from A. Allen. And it shall come to pass in the last day, said God, I will pour out of my spirit upon all flesh, and young shall see visions, and your old men shall see dreams. Acts 2:1. Then suddenly I heard the voice of the Lord. It was as clear, as distinct as a voice as it could be. It seemed to come from the very midst of the giant telescope. But when I looked at the telescope, I knew it hadn't come from there, but directly from heaven. The voice said, The eyes of the Lord run to and fro from the whole earth, and show himself strong in behalf of those whose heart is perfect toward him. Herein thou hast done foolishly. Therefore from thenceforth thou shalt have wars. Immediately when I heard the voice of God, I knew this was a quotation of Scripture, but never before had a thing come to me so forcibly by the power of the Spirit. The tickling of the telescope stopped. The man before me had used up his dime's worth, and he stepped away, and I knew I was next. As I stepped to the telescope and dropped in my dime, immediately the ticking started again. This ticking was an automatic clock, which would allow me to use the telescope for a definitely limited amount of time. As I swung the telescope to the north, suddenly the Spirit of God came upon me in a way that I had never thought of before. Seemingly in the Spirit, I was entirely cut away. I knew that the telescope itself had nothing to do with the distance, which I was suddenly enabled to see, for I seemed to see things far beyond the range of the telescope. Even on a bright, clear day, it was simply that God had chosen this time to reveal these things to me. For as I looked through the telescope, it was not as Manhattan Island that I saw, but a far larger view. The Empire State Building is located toward the south end of the Manhattan Island. Manhattan Island, which is original New York, is 12.5 miles long and 2 5/8 miles wide at its widest. Down its west edge runs the Hudson River, and down its east side the East River. To the south is the bay, out which stands the Statue of Liberty. That morning much of the view was impaired by fog, but suddenly as the Spirit of the Lord came upon me, the fog seemed to clear, until it seemed that I could see for thousands of miles. But that which I was looking upon was not Manhattan Island. It was the entire North American continent, spread out before me as a map is spread up to a table. It was not the East River and the Hudson River that I saw on either side, but the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And instead of the Statue of Liberty standing there in the bay, on her small island, I saw her standing far out in the Gulf of Mexico. She was between the United States and me. I suddenly realized that the telescope had nothing to do with what I was seeing, but that it was a vision coming directly from God. And to prove this to myself, I looked in the eyes away from the telescope so that I was no longer looking through the lens, but the same scene remained spread before me. There, clear and distinct, lay all the North American continent with all its great cities. To the north lay the Great Lakes, far to the northwest was New York City. I could see Seattle and Portland far to the northwest. Down the west coast there was San Francisco and Los Angeles. Closer in the foreground there lay New Orleans and the center of the Gulf Coast area. I could see the great towering ranges of the Rocky Mountains and tracing with my eye the Continental Divide. All this and more I could see spread out before me as a great map upon a table. As I looked, suddenly from the sky I saw a hand reach down. The gigantic hand was reaching out towards the Statue of Liberty. In a moment her gleaming torch was torn from her hand, and instead was placed a cup. And I saw protruding from that great cup a giant sword, shining as if a great light had been turned up its glistening edge. Never before had I seen such a sharp, glistening, dangerous sword. It seemed to threaten the entire world. As the great cup was placed in the hand of the Statue of Liberty, I heard these words, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, Drink ye and be drunken, spew and fall and rise no more, because of the sword which I will send. As I heard these words, I recognized them as a quotation from Jeremiah 27. I was amazed to hear the Statue of Liberty speak out in reply, I will not drink. Then as the voice of thunder, I heard again the voice of the Lord saying, Thus say the Lord of hosts, Ye shall certainly drink. Jeremiah 25:28. Then suddenly the giant hand forced the cup to the lips of the Statue of Liberty, and she became powerless to defend herself. The mighty hand of God forced her to drink every drop of the cup. As she drank the bitter dregs, these were the words that I heard. Should you be utterly unpunished? Ye shall not be unpunished, for I will call for a sword upon all inhabitants of the earth, saith the Lord of hosts. Jeremiah 25:29. When the cup was withdrawn from the lips of the Statue of Liberty, I noticed that the sword was missing from the cup, which could mean but one thing. The contents of the cup had been completely consumed. I knew that the sword merely typified war, death, and destruction, which is no doubt on the way. Then As one drunken on too much wine, I saw the Statue of Liberty become unsteady on her feet and begin to stagger and to lose her balance. I saw her splashing in the Gulf, trying to regain her balance. I saw her stagger again and again and fall to her knees. As I saw her desperate attempts to regain her balance and rise to her feet again, my heart was moved as never before with compassion for her struggles. But she staggered there in the Gulf. Once again I heard these words, "You shall drink and be drunken, and stew and fall, and rise no more, because of the sword that I shall send among you." As I watched, I wondered if the Statue of Liberty would ever be able to regain her feet, if she would ever stand again. As I watched, it seemed that there were all her power she struggled to rise, and finally staggered to her feet again, and stood there swaying drunkenly. I felt sure that at the moment she would fall again, possibly never to rise. I seemed overwhelmed with a desire to reach out of my hand to keep her head down above water, for I knew that if she ever fell again, she would drown there in the Gulf. Then as I watched, an amazing thing took place. Far to the northwest, just over Alaska, a huge black cloud was rising. As it rose, it was as black as night. It seemed to be in the shape of a man's head. As it continued to rise, I observed two light spots in the black cloud. It rose further, and a gaping hole appeared. I could see the black cloud was taking the shape of a skull, for now the huge white gaping mouth was plainly visible. Finally the head was complete. Then the shoulders began to appear, and on either side long black arms. It seemed that what I saw was the entire North American continent, spread out like a map upon the table, with its terrible skeleton form cloud arising from behind the table. It rose steadily until the form was visible down to the waist, and the waist the skeleton seemed to bend toward the United States, stretching forth a hand toward the east and one toward the west, one toward New York and one toward Seattle. As the awful form stretched forward, I could see that the entire attention seemed to be focused upon the United States, overlooking Canada, at least for the time being. As I saw the horrible black cloud in the form of a skeleton bending toward America, bending from the waist over, reaching down toward Chicago, out toward both coasts, I knew its one interest was to destroy the multitudes. As I watched in horror, the great black cloud stopped just above the Great Lake region and turned its face toward New York City. Then, out of a horrible, great, gaping mouth began to appear wisps of white vapor, which looked like smoke, as a cigarette smoker would blow puffs of smoke from its mouth. These whitish vapors were being blown towards New York City. The smoke began to spread until it had covered all the eastern part of the United States. Then the skeleton turned to the west, and out of a horrible mouth and nostrils came another great puff of white smoke. This time it was blown in the direction of the west coast. In a few moments' time, the entire west coast of Los Angeles area was covered with these vapors. Then toward the center came a third great puff. As I watched, St. Louis and Kansas City were enveloped in white vapors. Then on came towards New Orleans. Then on swept until it reached the Statue of Liberty. She was staggering drunkenly in the blue waters of the Gulf. As the white vapors began to spread around the head of the statue, she took in one gaping breath, and then began to cough as though to rid her lungs of the horrible vapor she had inhaled. One could readily discern the painful coughing that those white vapors had seared her lungs. Never before had I heard such shrill screaming sirens. They seemed to be everywhere, to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west. There seemed to be multitudes of sirens, and as I looked, I saw people everywhere running, but it seemed none of them ran more than a few paces, and then they fell. And even as I seen the Statue of Liberty struggling to regain her poise and balance, and finally falling to the last time, to die on her face, I now saw millions of people falling in the streets, the sidewalks struggling. I heard their screams for mercy and help. I heard their horrible coughing as their lungs had been seared with fire. I heard the moanings and groanings with the doomed and dying. As I watched, a few finally readied shelters, and I'll continue directly after this, America.